Okay, and welcome back. We're going down to Argentina this hour to talk to our colleague, Adrian Salbuchi, and we're going to spend some time this hour looking back at the end and actually the period of World War II as it impacted, well, the world. And there was a special role, obviously, at one of the very covert and occult layers, shall we say, of history that Argentina played in that period of time. And one of the experts on that is Adrian. Hi, Adrian. Welcome back. Thanks for being here.
Good evening, Jeff. Great talking to you, and thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. You're a remarkable man and a man of great vision and of history. And very few people understand history anymore. Our young people up here know virtually nothing about history. They probably couldn't outline World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War in the right order if you asked most of them. It's crazy. And the Korean War, too. So go ahead, please.
Well, no doubt what you're saying is very true. People, through the educational or uneducational system, not just in America, but throughout the world, we've lost the historical perspective. And when people ignore their own history and the history of the world and forget what their history is all about, it's pretty much like if you or I or any one of our listeners were to have a bump on the head and you get amnesia. If you have amnesia, you're very vulnerable because anybody can come around and say, hey, you don't remember me, but I'm your friend, I'm your brother, I'm your sister, I'm your cousin, I can help you out, do this, do that, etc. And, the poor fellow who's had amnesia, since he doesn't know about his past, he can be easily fooled and thrown completely astray. Well, the same with people. People that forget their history or don't know their history can be completely fooled and led astray. So, that is very true. It happens in the world over. And you were just touching upon the First World War and the Second World War. And, it's so important to have these ideas very much in mind because the very fact that we have official history separating World War I from World War II as if they were two completely isolated events is already a bit of falsification. It is already using history for political ends. An old professor of mine used to say, I don't think there was a First World War and a Second World War. I think there was a gigantic European civil war that began in 1914 and ended in 1945 with the total defeat of Europe. Because, the two colossus won those wars, the Soviet Union to the east and the United States to the west, and all of Europe lost it. So, the fact that we divorce World War I from World War II means that the real history of World War II can be conveniently falsified. Because people figure, the way they tell you, all of a sudden the world was wonderful, and on 1st September 1939, this German guy by the name of Hitler got up in a very bad mood, and he said, I know what I'll do today. I'm going to invade Poland and start World War II. So, that it's very easy because you easily demonize the people who are on one side, and you victimize the ones on the other.
Just a quick footnote about that. The reason Hitler invaded Poland, and if one simply does the research, one will come across the facts, was because the Poles had been killing literally thousands of German men, women, and children who were living in Poland by virtue of what happened after the first part of the World War, which was World War I. They were being slaughtered, and the German populace demanded that Hitler and Germany do something to stop the slaughter of Germans who were living under Polish rule.
Yeah, well, the 20th century was so violent, and there were so many slaughters and genocides and killings of all sorts, as you aptly mentioned. So there was definitely a reaction on the part of Germany in September of 1939. But what a lot of people forget is that Poland ceased to exist in 1797 as a sovereign state, and after Germany lost the First World War, the guys who carved up the new map of Europe in 1919, which was led by one American called Esaias Bauman. Esaias Bauman was the guy in charge of remapping Europe for British and American interests, and he was the president of the American Geographical Society, and he was also the first president of the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, a lot of people don't know that, but they figured, okay, we have to set up a buffer state between whatever we're going to leave from Germany and the newfound Soviet Union, so they refloated Poland after something like 125 years that it had no longer existed.
Right.
And they did that by carving away Prussia and Silesia from Germany. So obviously, at some point, the Germans were going to want to have that land back. That was the famous Treaty of Versailles that was imposed on Germany after World War I.
By the way, that treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, was the most cruel treaty that I think I've ever come across in my studies of history. That was unbelievable what they did to Germany. They guaranteed World War II.
They guaranteed World War II, and I always try to bring the Latin American perspective to that. We've with a group of colleagues here, we've made parallels between the horrendous Treaty of Versailles of 1919, which had its counterpart with Turkey and with Austria, or German Austria, after the Austro-Hungarian Empire was split up. A treaty was imposed of Saint Germain with the Austrians, and we had a similar case on a much smaller scale, albeit, down here, where after Argentina lost the Falkland-Malvinas War against Britain in 1982, or I should say Britain and the United States, they imposed, but much more discreetly upon us, a series of treaties with Britain first, and then with America, with the United States, which are very much along the same lines as what was done with Germany. We were practically, our armed forces were disbanded. The Patagonia, which we talked about on your program, from parallel 41 degrees downwards, the Army can practically not go in there. The Air Force and the Navy have to give the British notice, something like 10 days notice before any movements or any maneuvers are done in that area.
This is today,
have a gigantic
Adrian?
base in the Falklands.
This is today?
This is today. Oh, yes. That treaty was signed. First, a general agreement was signed in Madrid in February of 1990 by former President Carlos Menem and his foreign secretary at that time, Domingo Cavallo, and that became a formal treaty signed in London in November 1991, and which became a law in Argentina, an Argentine law, and that was when Argentina completely opened up its economy to foreign investors. We deregulated and practically deconstructed our state. We reduced the armed forces, very similarly as what happened with Versailles in 1919 with Germany. We disbanded practically all our armed forces, and that had an entire sequence where the Queen of England actually received President Menem's brother in a private audience in Britain in September of '89, and then in 1990 they sent a mission headed by Lord Montgomery, who visited Argentina to see, well, what are all these riches and state companies and resources that Argentina has, and that's when the state reform law came in place, and we started just deregulating the economy and privatizing everything. And Mr. Menem, who used Domingo Cavallo as his foreign secretary to achieve that, then put Cavallo as finance minister to execute the economic consequences of what we're just saying.
Wow. Very interesting. Well, in light of the fact that what you say about the Argentine military not being able to actually conduct maneuvers in its own country without notifying the British because of this treaty, we have to understand, and I think most of the listeners do, that Britain is a Zionist enclave, and this treaty was clearly manipulated to give Britain an early piece of control over the Patagonia area, which has been, as we've discussed, under survey by Israelis for literally decades. And there are obviously plans for the southern part of your country, my friend, unfortunately.
Yeah, that is very true, and it all gets so very interesting because a lot of stuff one can confirm from historical documents. I mean, everything that happened around the Malvinas and Falklands War, the fact that Britain now has a gigantic military base in the Falklands, probably having nuclear ships and aircraft with nuclear weapons, that definitely is a full control of the South Atlantic, the Patagonia, and Antarctica, especially Antarctica, because with everything that's happening in the world, and if the powers that be need to have a safe haven somewhere, well, I insist, look at a map of the world, and the only part of the planet that really has land in the southern hemisphere is a bit of Africa and about 2/3 of all of South America, especially Argentina, Uruguay to a smaller extent, and Chile. And then you have Antarctica, where in Antarctica you have a lot of stuff that is known and a lot of stuff that is not known. So although it never comes out in the newspapers, there definitely is a lot of interest from the global power elite regarding the things that will take place around Antarctica and very specifically in the Patagonia region, where the Falkland Islands is a vital military enclave. Now, that does in no way justify the stupidity of the Argentine military of having invaded in 1982 or having recovered, in a way, the Malvinas, because that used to be Argentinian territory back in the 19th century. It was part of the Spanish colonial empire down here. That does not justify the ridiculous mistakes that were made, because we practically gave them the Malvinas served on a platter so that they could take them over.
Unreal. All right, stand by. We'll take a break and come back with the ever-informative, enlightening Adrian Salbuchi, and we'll do that right after this. Okay, and we're back talking to Adrian in Argentina. All right, Adrian, this issue of the end of World War II and German submarines taking cargo and people to Argentina has always been of great intrigue for World War II historical buffs and other historians, not to mention what happened in 1947, the Byrd expedition to Antarctica. But tell us, in a larger scale, what was going on? Why was Argentina such an important item to the German government, the higher levels of it, in the war?
Well, Argentina traditionally has been a country which has had always very friendly relationship with Germany, and we had a very select immigration of Germans here, coming back from the 19th century, actually. Even actually, the very first, the founders of the city of Buenos Aires, which go back to 1560, the scribe, which was sort of the secretary for the entire settlement and founding of Buenos Aires, was a German. So he wrote his first views in German. It was part of the Spanish mission that came to Argentina. So there's been something like 4 or 5 centuries of continuity as far as that goes. But after when the Second World War broke out, or actually when National Socialism came into power in Germany, although Argentina traditionally has been very close to Britain economically because our land-based gentry were very close to Britain, the people were much more sympathetic towards Germany. So, and probably because we suffered the Brits here in the effects on the economy and the effects socially. So during the Second World War, actually, Argentina was one of the few countries, practically the only one at one point, that maintained very good relationships with Hitler's Germany. We only declared war when our arm was twisted in March of 1945 because we had maintained strict neutrality. That explains why, when the war formally ended on 8th May 1945, many people from Germany, many refugees, found their way down here, which doesn't mean that Argentina is a Nazi country the way very often it is portrayed in America. Many Jews also came down here because they were seeking refuge from all sorts of hardship in the former Soviet Union, in Europe and elsewhere. So definitely we have a rather strange case here. We have both sides very, very well represented. What does generate a lot of fascination is that after Germany formally surrendered to the Allies in May of 1945, many military installations, many military vessels, even aircraft that were still around the world and in different parts of the world and on the high seas, some of them we do know made their way to Argentina. as official documentation, we have only the cases of the submarines U-977 and U-530 that actually landed here in July and August of 1945.
Only two? Only two?
Formally documented, yes. This is formal history.
Right.
They both actually made their way into the port city of Mar del Plata, which is Argentina's main seaside resort, but about 5 miles away from there, it happens to have the only submarine base that Argentina had, it still has. So it would make sense for the Germans to say, okay, if we're going to go into any port, let's go into the port of Mar del Plata. But then there are many undocumented cases, rumors, and information of other submarines finding their way into Argentina much further down south. Mar del Plata is still not part of Patagonia. It is part of Buenos Aires province on the South Atlantic, but it's almost there. You do 100, 150 nautical miles, and you're already starting into the Patagonian part of the Atlantic Ocean.
I see. What happened to those two submarines, Adrian?
Well, what happened, the Americans immediately sent a mission down here. They took both crews back up to the States, and then, for the most part, they released them because they were just military sailors and officers. Actually, very young guys. Both ships were, the skipper of both ships were guys 25 and 26 years old. They were very young. Now, there are indications that because of the dates, July and August of 45, that they actually landed in Mar del Plata, and that both subs were empty, as is also the case with most of the others where there are rumors. I mentioned these two, the U-977 and the U-530, because it is official history. This is no rumor. This is not something that somebody made up. It is absolutely documented. Then
and what happened? What happened to the two submarines?
They were scuttled. They were taken to America.
All right.
They were taken. I mean, the U.S. Navy, I suppose, towed them back, and I think they were sunk finally. So they didn't even keep them. But the point that I think is worth highlighting is that these two subs, as well as about another 8 or 10 that I've been researching, but as I say, there is no formal documentation. I want to be very clear about that. All of them were empty. So there's a lot of rumors. Some of them said, they were full of gold. That, I think, is a rather ludicrous interpretation because, I mean, Germany, the Third Reich had far loftier and more important goals than just having a lot of gold in their subs. They seem to have been coming back from Antarctica. And we all know that in Antarctica, in Neuschwabenland, which the Norwegians call Queen Maud Land, which is not on the South American side of Antarctica, but more on the Indian Ocean side of Antarctica, the Germans already had made two expeditions, one in 1935 and a very important one in 1938 and 1939. And the guy who was basically in charge of overseeing that was Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who was the guy in charge of the entire submarine fleet, very fittingly, and he was also the last head of state of the Third Reich.
Exactly.
He was strictly a professional military man, and he is also quoted, I say because there's a lot of information and misinformation here, as having said, even in the 40s, when the war had just started, that a base had been set up in a far-off land. He never said Antarctica. He just said somewhere on Earth, which would allow the German Führer and other people, other dignitaries, if necessary, to find a safe haven. Now, that was just something that was mentioned in passing, but when you start joining the dots, you start to get a picture of all this.
You'd have to have really put a major amount of energy into creating something in Antarctica that would be survivable, habitable, and all the rest of it. And that apparently was going on in the late 30s, so there was time to do that. Interesting. All right, it's down there somewhere, or what's left of it. Hold on, we'll be right back. Okay, and we're taking a look back at an absolutely fascinating portion of history, that being the end of the whole World War II period, and Argentina. So your best guess is that there may have been, who knows, maybe a dozen U-boats taking people and materials and who knows what to Argentina. They probably were offloaded, and maybe they were scuttled offshore as well to hide them.
Yes, and from what I've been able to gather here, at least there's talk about at least 12 of these submarines having reached the Atlantic coast of Argentina. Mm-hmm. 2 of which are documented. The other 10 are not. I mean, this is something I have to be very clear about. But I would add, on a more personal note, that it's a well-known fact that many of the people from Germany, who had actually refugees from the Third Reich, landed in Brazil, landed in Paraguay, and landed in Argentina. Now, practically all of them by now, as far as I know, they're all dead, because let's not forget that 66 years have gone by since the end of World War II. But I was lucky to have been a personal friend of 3 of them. One was a gentleman by the name of Rense. I can mention their names because they've all died, and they died in almost complete poverty. Hans Reise, who used to live in Cordova, Sigurd von Wurm, who used to live in Rosario, and Wilfred von Oven, who used to live in Buenos Aires. Wilfred von Oven actually passed away in 2008. And the latter, Mr. von Oven, was particularly interesting because he was the last private secretary of Joseph Goebbels, who was Hitler's number 3 man practically, and he was the propaganda minister. And in a way, he mentioned in private, informal conversations that those 2 subs, the U-977 and the U-530, were just 2 of many more. And in all cases, and he pointed that out to me, it's no coincidence that they were all found empty, because whatever it is that they carried on board, they first took it to wherever they had to go, which he insinuated could have very well been the Neuschwabenland base, or whatever, or bases that might have been there. And then on the way back, they obviously could not go back to Europe. They obviously did not want to run into any British or American ships, and that's why they decided to say, okay, let's call somewhere on the shores of Argentina.
Might they have gone to Argentina as a primary destination, offloaded near shore onto a small boat or boats, and then turned themselves in, or then scuttled themselves? Maybe the whole Antarctic thing was a misdirection.
It could. That might also be an option. That might also be an option. Don't forget that they also took advantage of the fact that when they all reached the shores of Argentina, which was basically between June of 1945 and about September, October of 1945, that coincided with the winter down here. So our shores were very cold, very bleak, and whatever they could do it in almost complete secrecy because there's nobody around it. I mean, even today, that part of Argentina is almost completely unpopulated. In 1945, it was much more so that they could have really reached the shore, even landed, and practically nobody would have seen them.
Probably would have had to transfer, though, to a ship. I don't know, vessel, yes. Unless they built a pier and were able to, a deep water pier, and were able to come. But anyway, this is all very, very interesting. I'm wondering that, obviously, we have the technology to locate underwater relics, sunken ships. If a U-boat were to be located off Argentina's shores, I wonder if the Argentine government would pull it up and put it on display or something like that. This is a piece of history. You know, we have to remember also that there were approximately 33,000 German men in the submarine forces during the war, and I think the mortality rate was in excess of 90%. They never came home. Yeah,
I think a lot of them probably found refuge reaching the coast of not only of Argentina, but Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Paraguay. I mean, all the countries down here, for the most part, were either neutral or friendly towards, at least from the point of view of the population, friendly towards Germany. Brazil actually fought in World War II on the Allied side, but nevertheless, many Germans made their way down into Brazil, and they were never bothered or anything of that sort.
We're talking about thousands, Adrian?
Yes, definitely. I can give you an example. There is a town, anybody can look it up on the map, called General Belgrano in the province of Cordova, which was actually founded around the sailors these were interned. These were not sent to America, who were interned in Argentina after the Battle of the South Atlantic, which took place right at the beginning of World War II in 1939. The Graf Spee, a German destroyer, was we had 3 British ships ganging up on the Graf Spee that had been damaged. The vessel entered the port of Montevideo in Uruguay. According to international law, it could only stay there for 48 hours. The captain, Hans Leinsdorf, knew that as soon as he went out to sea, that the British were waiting for him, they were going to destroy him. So he he interned the entire crew in Argentina, and they are living. They lived very peacefully in Cordoba. He took the ship to the middle of the River Plate. He put bombs in it. He sank it so that it would not fall to the Brits. He made his way to Buenos Aires and committed suicide because he kept that old military tradition that the captain goes down with his ship. Amazing. But that was in 1939 when the war had just started. Very different was the situation after 1945 when the war had ended and Germany had obviously lost it.
So what you're saying, I guess, is that Adolf Hitler is not still alive at 118 years of age and living the high life in Argentina.
Oh, no way. I think that definitely was part of a myth.
Of course.
And I think it was conveniently propagated because it was a way of misleading people, because whatever was unloaded from those ships, I don't think it was either gold, Nazi gold as they say, and much less Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun. It was probably something far, far more important, which is still around, and I think it keeps a lot of the people from the powers that be very much awake at night. These are the dots that need to be joined. Jeff, for instance, this friend of mine, Wilfried von Offen, one of the things that I remember he told me, he said, we all know the case, because it was very high profile in the 60s, or since the 60s, of Adolf Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann was, he had found his way to Argentina. He was living under an alias. He was an SS officer, and he was kidnapped by the Israelis in 1960, taken to Israel, tried, and I think he was hung in 1962. He was executed. Now, they say that he was executed because he was the father of the concentration camps and the Holocaust, etc. But what my friend, and he was the private secretary of Joseph Goebbels, so he was probably in a place to know, he said that was not the reason. The reason was because Mr. Adolf Eichmann, as an SS officer in the SD, which was the security service, the Sicherheitsdienst, he was one of the guys who was in charge of negotiating with Zionist organizations the exit of Jews from Europe to go to Palestine. And he had a lot of information, and he seems to have known a lot of the plans of that the Zionists had, not only of taking Jews from Europe to Palestine, but taking Jews from Europe to Argentina. So they really needed to get their hands on this guy to make sure that he would not open his mouth. Now, Adolf Eichmann never did. He was just living very, very discreetly and obscurely in a Buenos Aires suburb. But they probably felt that it was sufficiently dangerous that they had to capture him, kidnap him, make this sham trial in Israel, and execute him.
Well, that's the same thing that happened with Rudolf Hess.
Exactly.
They kept him in prison, and eventually the Brits, probably MI6, went in and killed him when he was in his 80s. He knew too much. Hitler had sent him to Britain in 1941 to stop the war. They wanted to make peace, and unfortunately he was captured and turned over to the Zionist element, including Churchill, who didn't want peace. Otherwise, the war might have ended in the West in 1941, and Germany would have been free to take on the evils of communist Bolshevism in Soviet Russia. 90% of World War II was fought on the Eastern Front, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who may not know that. It was not fought in the West. All right, we'll be right back. Okay, let's get right back to our fascinating conversation with Adrian Salbuchi in Argentina. And we're not even going to go into, folks, the Holocaust and all of that. When I say freed Germany,